Well, hello. This week in the commentary, I wanted to tackle an issue that probably you might have been wondering about as you read through Leviticus and Exodus as well before that. You probably noticed quite a bit of discussion there about slavery. And maybe that left you with an awkward feeling because it did not appear to say anywhere in there in the scripture that slavery was wrong or was a problem. In fact, it might even appeared that to be supporting slavery and maybe even encouraging it. Many American slave owners during the increasing opposition to slavery here in our own country, many slave owners would make the case that the Bible condoned it, that the Bible taught it, that it was never condemned in the scriptures, and therefore it shouldn't be condemned in our society. But the opposition would say, no, the Bible does condemn what you're doing. And so, on the basis of biblical principles and so forth, many argued that slavery needed to be abolished. So, you might be wondering, okay, what is the Bible actually saying? And how am I supposed to understand its comments or even its laws and rules governing slavery? Well, you're probably familiar with the name Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she described the nature of slavery before the Civil War this way. She said the legal power of the master amounts to an absolute despotism over body and soul, and there is no protection for the slave's life. Now, the Israelites were familiar with this kind of slavery, for they were slaves in Egypt and were controlled, absolutely, by Pharaoh, but offered absolutely no protection by the Pharaoh. So what we have here in Leviticus then is a major reforms taking place on how slavery is to be conducted. And the reforms were meant to protect against the very abuses that the Israelites suffered and the very kinds of abuses that took place even in our own history here in America and in the centuries leading up to it. Now, what we see here in Exodus and in Leviticus, and also you'll see some in Deuteronomy, are the distinctions between slavery as it was practiced by the Israelites and the slavery of America's past. The two are actually very different. One difference is how a slave became a slave was very different. One scholar named Paul Copan, I borrowed very liberally from him, says this. He says that servanthood, usually translated as slavery in the Bible, existed in Israel precisely because poverty existed. No poverty, no servants in Israel. And if servants lived in Israel, this was voluntary, typically poverty-induced, but not forced. So how did people become slaves back in the good old 1700s? Well, they were kidnapped, pretty much. They were stolen from their own native lands, sometimes sold by sometimes other Africans. When African nations sometimes would be warring against each other, they would take the prisoners of their enemy, the enemy tribe, and then they would sell them off as Portuguese and so forth would come and would take their prisoners, buy their prisoners in exchange for other goods, and then they would enslave those prisoners. And so this was against their will. This was forced slavery. So very different. They were not rounded up, not kidnapped, and that sort of thing. But as Paul Copan will go on to say, he says, rather, out of desperation, a man might hire out temporarily or even sell himself or his wife or his children to help get the family out of debt. So it was a voluntary servitude. The man, the wife, and the children would have a roof over their heads with food and clothing supplied by the employer or the master. So, very different scenario. In other words, this was actually a help rather than some sort of oppressive institution. The slaves themselves were not being oppressed and being mistreated, and they were actually selling themselves into slavery in order to rescue them. And the person who was receiving them to be as their master and to receive them into their home was actually helping them and even rescuing them from their poverty. So the second thing, though, is what it meant to be a slave was very different. Again, to quote Paul Copan, he says there that we should compare Hebrew debt servanthood, which many translations render as slavery, more fairly to apprentice-like positions to pay off debts, much like the indentured servitude during America's founding, when people worked for approximately 7 years to pay off the debt for their passage to the New World. Then they became free. An Israelite servant's guaranteed eventual release within 7 years was a control or regulation to prevent the abuse and the institutionalizing of such positions. So the release year then reminded the Israelites that poverty-induced servanthood was not an ideal social arrangement. So all of these laws we're reading then, what was it meant to do? It was meant to regulate, to prevent the abuses, to protect as well the slaves, which I'll get into in a minute then. So this was more like, again, like a contractual obligation, okay? Sometimes the government will hire people and will send them to school and to learn a specific skill, and in exchange for a certain amount of time working for the government using those skills. Now, if that person decides to bail on them before that time expires, then often it comes with severe penalties, not their lives or a beating, but usually they have to pay back the costs of the schooling and of the training. So that's what Copan suggests then. It's more like a contractual obligation. Now, there are certain other professions as well. I've already mentioned one, but other professions and also in lines of work that have a similar arrangement, where the person's not a slave necessarily, as we think of it, but they cannot simply walk off the job without consequences. So as part of your discussion, think about that. Can you think of anything like this? And what I'm thinking of right now are two things, and each of them were uniforms. So just think about that. Now, this gets into the third thing then. How the slaves were viewed and treated was also completely different. Slaves, you see, had rights. Slaves had deserved and had protection, and also had several options when it came to gaining their freedom. Now, if a man killed his slave, it was considered a capital crime and carried with it the death penalty. You can read about that in Exodus 21:20. If a man permanently injured his slave, such as his maybe lost a hand or an eye or something like that, then the slave was to be immediately freed. He had no business keeping him as a slave any longer. And you read that as well in Exodus 21 for 26 through 27. So slave masters were also to treat their slaves well, not ruthlessly, but in a manner that shows that they fear God, and that we read in Leviticus 25:43 just recently. If a slave ran away from his master and came to someone else, he was not to go back to his master. The slave was to stay with the one to whom he came, for it probably meant that the master was mistreating him, and you can read about that in Deuteronomy 23:15 through 16. And then when the slave was set free, he wasn't simply just set free and said, okay, have a nice life. The master had the responsibility of giving what he needed to get back on his own feet. He was not to go empty-handed. Deuteronomy 15:12 through 14. So these are just some of the ways that slavery then was different than what we think of as slavery. Our understanding of it has been so shaped by of the past, by the American institution as we know of slavery, and so we need to understand it differently when we're reading through these texts, and when it mentions slavery. It's a very, very different idea, very different approach. Now, I know it doesn't answer all the questions or make all of the awkward statements made about slaves less awkward. I know there are others there that are maybe a little bit difficult, and perhaps that can be more discussion. But the reason why I want to bring this up, because this at least gives you some parameters to approach it and to help you understand how to interpret such passages, and how we, in our modern context, which is so anti-slavery, and rightfully so. We really should see the slavery of the past as a very evil thing. Obviously, just by a few things that I mentioned here, you can see that how slaves were being treated in the 1800s was completely against what God said in His Word. So they were very, very different. But anyways, I hope this helps you understand how to approach that issue in the Scriptures, especially if someone comes to you and says, makes the claim or the accusation that somehow God supports slavery. Then maybe you will be better prepared to give an answer to that person and help them see that the two were very different and really cannot be compared as the same thing. I hope that helps. God bless you in your reading in Numbers. And just a quick word about that. Numbers is also one of those books where when you start reading it, you might feel like you're hitting a brick wall. There's a lot of counting, a lot of census taking and so forth, and how many of this and how many of that. Hang in there. Don't give up. Don't be discouraged. But keep working through those texts. Take this into account as you read Numbers, actually. The children of Israel are in the desert, and so there's a dryness about the book of Numbers as well. And so I think we are to, in some ways, step into that kind of dryness and that sort of, the difficulties of the wilderness there. Just keep progressing along best as you can, and just trust that God is going to minister to you and encourage you and feed you through His Word. God bless. Take care until next time.